Howdy, fellow cardboard pushers. This is Grant Lindenberg coming to you with episode number 17, A Border Victory. We're back to just me this time, but that means I'm going to try to squeeze in two games. We'll look at A Greater Victory from Steve Carey and Revolution Games, and then at Border States, a quick-playing American Civil War game from Stéphane Brachet and Shakos Games. It's been busy since last we spoke. In addition to Twitter falling apart, Dungeons and Dragons seems to be under attack from its current owners. Personally, I took part in the Armchair Dragoons online convention, giving us the bonus episode I posted recently, my interview with Harold Buchanan. There's been lots of good feedback about that episode. Interestingly, there's a little over 100 views of it on YouTube. There have been over 500 downloads of the podcast release so far. So Pushing Cardboard remains most popular as a podcast rather than a video channel, which is just fine with me. And then going back to the previous episode, which featured an interview with Trevor Bender, I'm happy to report that C3 Magazine issue 36 is now out, and Trevor's new game on North Africa is in my hands. I can't wait to play it. It looks great. The whole issue looks great. It's a packed issue. Well worth looking for. Check it out. There's been a fair bit of news since the last time we spoke. The much-delayed Charles S. Roberts Awards for 2021 were finally announced. Jerry White's Atlantic Chase from GMT won Game of the Year along with a bunch of other awards, including Rule Book of the Year. If you played that game, you know that rule book may be the best that's ever been written. It's a great game. It's sold out, but it's being reprinted by GMT, so get a copy when it hits the shelves again. I recommend it. In other news from GMT, they are amalgamating all the Command and Colors Napoleonic stuff. The first 5 boxes will come in just 2 boxes in the future, cutting down on duplication of charts and pieces, apparently. But in the meantime, for those that have a partial collection started and want to finish it rather than starting over with the new packaging, they're reprinting all the modules one last time before switching over to the new model. So order them while you can if that's your thing. Also from GMT, there's a new print and play variant for Red Flags Over Paris available for free. Or you can wait for issue 37 of C3 Magazine, where it will be part of the goodies in that issue. But that's probably a year down the line. So if you're a dedicated Red Flags Over Paris player, grab it while you can. And then new to the P500 list is another levy and campaign game, Seljuk. This one was designed by the popular war game YouTuber Justagard, and it pits the Eastern Romans against the Seljuk Turks. I'll definitely get it, but I have to admit I still haven't played Almoravid or Inferno yet, so I'm probably just following along myself with that series. Speaking of series I'm behind on, there's also another Next War game on the P500 as well, Next War Iran. I didn't order this. I've only got a couple games in that series, and the current hypothetical conflicts there are not really my thing. So I guess, I don't know. I guess I'm happy to say I'm able to say no to something on the P500 list. One final P500 note, though. The new version of Red Winter is well into the 800s, but they're also doing an update kit, and it's at 430. If either of these appeals to you, please sign up. I'm really eager to get the new version of that rather than buying the original used. So let's get some more action under those numbers and push GMT into getting them into the production queue. At Revolution Games, the big new release after A Greater Victory has been Mike Ranella's new solo game, Stalingrad: Advance to the Volga. Regular listeners of the podcast will know I'm a big Ranella fan, and I really enjoy his 2-player game on the same topic, Stalingrad Verdun on the Volga. I hope Revolution and Mike have a hit with this, but as someone who rarely plays solo-specific games, I also hope this is a colossal failure and Mike sticks with 2-player games from now on. Yes, I am selfish that way. Speaking of solo games, 2 of the last 3 games from Legion Games are solo air games. Skyhawk is a Vietnam game, and Aces of Valor is a World War One game. Both look cool. Both make me wish they were two-player, especially the World War One game. I love World War One air games. But I guess I should be satisfied with the fact that the other game Legion just released was the latest game from Kim Kanger. It's called La Primogenita, and it's the same East Africa setting as his previous game Road to Karen, but this is a completely new system and includes an order system that's unlike anything I've seen before. I'm sure I'll be looking at this game in a future episode because it's really worth exploring. VUCA Games just keeps pumping out beautiful work. Their latest is an all-new version of a 1982 game called Task Force, set in the Pacific in World War II. It includes scenarios for most of the big battles of 1942, with rules for creating your own scenarios as well. I've played the first 5 scenarios. The first 4 are solo learning affairs, but based on real battles. And then the 5th is the first head-to-head one. I'm really enjoying it. If you take a look at Mark Herman's Pacific War and find it just too daunting, this might be the game for you. It's just 20 pages of rules and another 20 pages of scenarios. Coming up for me, I hope to be participating in the next event from San Diego HistCon. It's a one-day online convention coming up March 18th, 2023. I'll put a link in the show notes and on the website. If all goes well and according to plan, I'll interview Brian Train with an emphasis specifically on a game he's designed and used to help with an urban operations training course for the U.S. Army. Brian's an entertaining speaker and has a ton of experience designing and thinking about the modern combat space. So I hope some of you will come and check it out. A full pass for the convention is only $5, and though it's only a single day, it's going to be a long day. They're starting the morning sessions in European time zones and finishing the evening sessions on California time. So wherever you are, there should be something available that fits your schedule. At the Pushing Cardboard website and Discord server, we ran a couple of polls in December asking what games players enjoyed the most in 2022, as well as what was their favorite new game of the year. The latter question was a bit of a bust, as more people chose an answer that indicated they hadn't played any new 2022 games yet at all. They're still working their way through their own shelves of older stuff more than getting to anything new. So we didn't get a lot of answers there. But among the people who did try new games, the top 3 were a Greater Victory from Revolution, Pacific War, and Almoravid from GMT. The most enjoyed list was much more interesting. 23 people either came by the website or dropped by the Discord server with an answer and let us know what they'd been playing and enjoying. Everyone chose their top 5, and I weighted the answers in a spreadsheet. The top 10 or 12, as there's a tie at the bottom, were ASL, Last Blitzkrieg from MMP, Combat Commander, Command and Colors Ancients, Flying Colors, Old School Tactical Volume 2 from Flying Pig, Red Flag Over Paris, Panzer, Paths of Glory, Stonewall's Sword, and Undaunted Normandy. I was really surprised to see the Last Blitzkrieg at number 2. It's obviously time I checked that game out. I was glad to see a few games I haven't played on the list, and then there's 3 there that I don't even own, which is good news for me, I suppose. There's a full article on the poll on the website. It's under articles and then lists. Check it out there. Or I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Drop by the website. Let us know what you think. And in the meantime, if you're a Discord fan, drop by the Pushing Cardboard Pushing Cardboard Discord server. There's usually someone there talking about a game, and I'll have a link in the show notes for that one as well. On to what's on the table. This is going to be a big episode as it is, so I won't cover everything that I've been playing. Just a few highlights or new things. My Stalingrad Verdun on the Volga game ended with a German victory. I think the Russians are slightly harder to play in this game, but only slightly. It was fun all the same. Over on Yukata, I played Pax Porfiriana, and then we moved to rally the troops to play Pax Pamir. And as I might have mentioned earlier, I'm also playing Nevsky there. Um, my last 100 yards game started back up. My first scenario with AFVs and an anti-tank gun. They haven't met yet, so I await learning how that mechanic works in the system. I'm still playing Undaunted Normandy. It's kind of like crack. Even though we both have all the rest of the expansions, we're sticking with playing through that first box because it's so much fun. I've got lots of ASL still going on versus via Vassal. I've got a couple scenarios and then another Lone Canuck historical module crossing the Moro. My Canucks will defend against Robert's Germans. He clobbered me in the Hell's Highway game, so I'll be looking for revenge there. And my game of Not War But Murder is back in progress. Another Mike Ranella title. This one's set in the U.S. Civil War at Cold Harbor. And, of course, lots of other things, but that's sort of the highlights for now. Okay, new games to the collection. This, this is a long list this time. Father, it's been 2 months since my last confession. In my defense, some of these were P500s or pre-orders that suddenly arrived, and a couple of review copies, but boy, it does feel like just too much. Undaunted Stalingrad. Whew, this is a huge box, and for the first time, Undaunted adds a campaign game. I'm curious as to how it works and if it's replayable. From snippets I've read online, it almost feels like Gloomhaven or something like that. Posters on BGG preface their questions with warnings of spoilers, so I don't. I guess that's why I think that. Anyway, however it works, eventually I'm diving in. Desert Fox Deluxe from Compass. I don't have a ton of Compass games. I'm a sucker for North Africa games. This one has a bit of a mixed reputation, but there were enough folks online who said that if you just apply a couple of band-aids to the rules, it works great. So I bought it because North Africa desert. I'm a sucker. Table Battles from Hollandspiel and the first expansion. It was their annual sale, and I've always been intrigued by this system. I've sold it once now to see how it works, and I was impressed. It looks like a perfect little filler game. I look forward to playing more scenarios from it. As well, At Any Cost, The Great War in the East, also from Hollandspiel. I don't know much about this one, but it was an undergame topic, and I wanted another game from the sale to lower the per game shipping costs, and this is the one that caught my eye, so I look forward to checking this out. Prelude to Rebellion from Compass. I've waited on this one. I've wanted it for a while, but it was always just so expensive on the shelf of my friendly local game store, and then it was on sale at the Compass sale, so perfect. The designer, Marco Poutre, is an active BGG presence and an interesting guy. The game looks good. It's another non-mainstream topic, so I got it. Flashpoint South China Sea from my buddy Harold. Generally, shorter games are not my thing, but there was a bit of a dust-up online about how much this was a game versus a simulation, so I had to order it and see for myself. I look forward to it. Norway 1940. Okay, this was off the beaten track. The publisher of this is Trafalgar Editions from Spain, I think. I read something in passing about this game and just ordered it on a whim. It just looks so interesting, and from a publisher I don't know. So yeah, it's very likely to get the full deep dive down the line as well, because I like showcasing smaller publishers and seeing what they're up to. La Primogenita, as mentioned before, I'm a Kim Kanger fan, so I pre-ordered this. I've played it a bit solo, and not surprising, it's got some cool mechanics that I haven't seen before. Kim Kanger is one of my favorite designers, and this looks to be as interesting as his work always is. Task Force Carrier Battles in the Pacific from VUCA. As mentioned before, it's interesting to see this come out around the same time as Pacific War from GMT. This is an infinitely more approachable game, and from what I've played so far, still very fun and feels like War in the Pacific. I look forward to more of it. From the Compass sale, I got two other titles as well. Barbarians at the Gates, based on the recommendation of Justin Facino, and Death in the Trenches, a World War I grand strategy game with a giant amount of possible random events. This one's intrigued me for a while, so I was glad to get it at a sale price. And then finally, two from the latest batch from GMT. Inferno, the third in the Levian campaign series that I'm desperately trying to catch up on. and the new edition of the Russian campaign. I chose this over the Compass version, as I heard the Compass version was basically a reprint of the original Jedco game, whereas the GMT version is a reprint of the Avalon Hill version with all the variants and balancing rules that have sprouted up on the competitive tourney scene over the years. So I chose the latter. Anyway, yikes, that's a lot. I hope I still have time left in the podcast to actually talk about playing a few of these games. Okay, let's get started with a real deep dive. We're taking a look at A Greater Victory by Steve Carey, published by Revolution Games. This is the latest installment in Herman Luttman's Blind Sword series on the American Civil War. I've played the first two, Stonewall's Sword and Thunder in the Ozarks, and now I'm skipping to the end. It's interesting to see how the system has changed and refined, sometimes to fit the particular battle, but I think sometimes just to improve the experience. Like many other series, Blind Swords has moved on from a simple rulebook for each game to the common series rules plus exclusive rules model. This has the upside for veteran players of making all the changes from the basic system easily accessible, but it's still a drag to have two rulebooks. This is obviously not a problem confined to this game, and I'm not sure just having a single rulebook is the answer. In theory, I like the idea of a single rulebook with exclusive rules highlighted, but I imagine it's difficult to highlight rules that have been dropped. In any case, the rules load is not heavy here. There's 14 pages of series rules and just 6 pages of exclusive rules, with maybe a page or two more scenario-specific rules for each scenario. A Greater Victory plays out the Battle of South Mountain, September 14th, 1862. For fans of history, this engagement has a few outstanding issues. It's the result of the famous recovery by the Union of a copy of Special Order 191, wherein Confederate General Robert E. Lee had detailed his plans to split his army in two, with one half headed towards Harper's Ferry and the rest at Boonesboro, near where our battle takes place. Also surprising is that Union General George McClellan moved decisively to engage the latter half of Lee's army. McClellan is well known for dragging his heels and demanding twice the amount of troops needed to get most jobs done, but here he acts decisively and competently. But spoiler alert, after winning the battle, he doesn't follow up aggressively, leading to the fall of Harper's Ferry and Lincoln dismissing him. The actual engagement featured battles for 3 gaps in the mountainous terrain. In A Greater Victory, we see 2 of those battles, as the third was a minor action and would have extended the map further south, if I have my geography correct. As with previous Blind Swords games, the victory point locations are asymmetric, with different values depending on which side controls them. There's quite a few across the map, but the biggest ones are at these 2 main points, Fox's Gap and Turner's Gap. Turner's Gap, the big one, as it's the big road between the mountains, and it grants the most victory points in the game. Speaking of the map, this is the first map in the series not to be drawn by the late Rick Barber. Instead, we have Edmund Hudson making the map in a definite Rick Barber style. I'm not sure if this map has been hand-drawn like I assumed Rick Barber maps were. It appears a little bit more like computer art to me. But that's not a bad thing. If you felt Rick Barber's maps were a bit busy or a bit loud, then you're going to love this new style. It's like Barber maps. It features a slightly more muted color palette and a less busy line style. I do miss the Barber hand lettering. Here, Hudson has used a script font. I guess if it's not to be hand lettered, I think a little less less fussy typeface might have been a better choice here. But that's a small quibble. It's a one-map game, but there's no lack of terrain. It's not called South of Mountain for nothing. There's 11 elevation levels on this map. And given how steep the terrain is, several of the exclusive rules deal with the effects of this terrain. There's 4 types of slopes: gentle, regular, steep, and vertical. In regular Blind Swords games, crossing a regular slope doesn't add anything to the movement point cost, but here, crossing even a gentle slope costs an extra MP. Regular slopes cost more going up and down, and even more for steep slopes, and vertical slopes are impassable. As well, the normal combat shift for firing over troops is not used here, as the fire is so far over the heads of the intervening units with these sharp slopes. I've explained the Blind Sword systems before when talking about the first game, Stonewall's Sword, but for those who missed it, Here's basically how it all works. The map scale is 150 yards across each hex, and each turn represents 30 minutes of real time. The units are regiments or battalions, and each unit is affiliated with a parent brigade. In turn, each of those brigades is usually affiliated with a parent division. The only counters that appear on the map are the regiments and brigades. The counters for the brigade commanders and the division commanders are kept off-board and used as part of the chit pull activation system. Most units are 2 steps with a step on each side. Single steps units are blank on the back. Cavalry units vary from game to game in Blind Sword series. In this game, the front is the mounted side and the reverse is the dismounted side. So dismounted, they become basically a single step infantry unit. Along the bottom of the counters are 2 numbers. On the left is the unit strength, and on the right is the cohesion rating. The unit strength are used for both firing and close combat. The cohesion rating is used in melee and when being attacked. It's a bit of a defensive rating. There's also a small symbol denoting which weapon type they are equipped. Each unit is equipped with, and that determines the effectiveness at various ranges. And finally, at the top is the name of the brigade that the regiment belongs to. Cavalry counters are pretty similar to infantry, but artillery works a little differently in that the units don't belong to brigades. They all work independently at the beginning of each turn, but more on that later. The only other thing to mention about the units is stacking limits. You can stack up to 3 units in a hex with a maximum of 10 total strength points. Artillery strength points are calculated a little differently for stacking purposes only. There's a little chart for that. And cavalry may not stack with infantry or artillery. The other main counters in the game are the brigade leaders, division leaders, and event chits. The brigade leader counters are only used to keep track of which brigades have activated each turn. The division leader counters, along with the commander-in-charge counter, go into the chit pull cup along with the event chits. The mix of event chits and leader chits that start the game are spelled out in the scenario setup for each of the 3 scenarios. There's 2 smaller scenarios and then the entire battle scenario. Then as you proceed through the turns, more leaders and events may be added to the mix, or some events or leaders may be withdrawn. So here's how a turn works. First up, the cup is stocked with chits. Both players put their available leaders in the cup as well as choose 1 event each to put in the cup, and then they take the rest of their event chits and choose 1 more randomly to put in the cup. This increases to 2 later in the game. Once the chit cup is stocked, it's the artillery phase. Players take turns activating 1 hex worth of artillery at a time and either firing it or moving it until neither player has any artillery left that they wish to use. And then there's a new step from earlier iterations of the blind sword systems. At the end of the artillery phase, each player can choose 1 hex with artillery to rally or attempt to rebuild. This used to happen when nearby infantry was activated, but this is cleaner, but only allows a single hex per turn to rally. Then we get to the meat of the game, the chit draw phase. The chit is drawn from the cup. If it's an event, the owning player either holds it for later or plays it right away. Events can be things like an extra fire attack, an extra rally attempt, or a command confusion, where you get to mess with your opponent's orders for one of their brigades. If a commander-in-chief chit is pulled, that side may get an extra activation. The CNC chits in A Greater Victory work a little differently than in some Blind Swords titles. First, they don't show up in the counter mix until partway through the game. Lee arrives at 1 p.m. and McClellan at 3:30 p.m. Second, they're not automatic activations. Both have an activation number of 2, meaning you have to roll a 2 or less to get to use them. So even when drawn, you only have a 1 in 3 chance. But the big difference is that the chits don't automatically go in the cup. In other Blind Swords games I've played, the CNC chits go in the cup each turn once they're available. But in A Greater Victory, they're treated like event chits. That means they only end up in the cup if a player chooses it as their key event or if it's chosen as one of the 1 or 2 random events. I talked to designer Steve Carey about this decision. He said neither commander had much active input into the battle. Lee had fallen off his horse the day before and wasn't in great shape, and McClellan was McClellan, not the most dynamic field general. There are 2 generic event chits that also go in the cup each turn. Fog of War chit means you roll for an event on the Fog of War table, but the Fortunes of War chit is more dangerous. When this chit is drawn, the next chit drawn does not happen no matter what. You may lose the activation of an important brigade if this comes out at the wrong time. Back to the sequence play. If the chit pulled was a division commander or a commander-in-chief, then the owner rolls to see if they get a full activation or a limited activation. Like the C&C chits, each division commander has an activation rating on that chit, generally between 3 and 5. You have to roll that number or less to get a full activation. If it's a limited activation, you can't do much. You choose one of those brigades of that division and can only do fire attacks with those regiments. No movement, no rally, no close combat. Then you flip over that regimental commander's chit, and that regiment is done for the turn. If it's a full activation, the player then has to decide what sort of orders to give the brigade: maneuver, attack, defend, or regroup. The order is the same for all regiments in the activated brigade. Each order allows a different amount of movement and a different amount of engagement and a different recovery capability. Maneuver allows the most movement points, but you're not allowed to fire at the enemy nor move adjacent. Attack lets you move less, but you can both fire and engage in close combat. Defend and regroup are the only options that let you shake off any bad morale effects or give you the chance to regain a lost step. Interestingly, the sequence for actions for an activated brigade is fire attacks first, followed by movement, then close combat, and finally rally if ordered. So an activated regiment can fire on an enemy unit, then move adjacent and declare close combat. The defender gets defensive fire, and then the melee is resolved. Movement's fairly basic. Each of the orders gives infantry units a different amount of movement points to spend. Different terrain types cost different amounts of movement points. As I mentioned earlier, the map is all up and down with various degrees of slope, so off-road movement costs a lot of extra movement points. The combat system uses the strength points of the firing unit. Range and weapon type play a role in determining if you use 100% of your strength points or 50% for long range. Once you have your total strength point column, then there may be column shifts for target terrain or weapon type. Once a final attack column is determined, you roll 2d6 of different colors, but rather than a range of 2 to 12, you read them as digits, giving you a range from 11 to 66. You can consult the CRT to see if you have had any effect. The CRT is ingenious here, as one roll gives you a range of effects on each column. That range corresponds to the possible cohesion rating of the target. Lower cohesion ratings get hit more often and harder. Having determined how hard of a hit you generated, if any, green, yellow, or red, you roll again on the cohesion test chart. The colored die will give you a depletion result, the target may lose a step, while the white die will give you a skedaddle result, the defender may retreat. If the defender retreats, you'll have the option to advance after combat. If a unit is faced with losing its last step, they'll make a roll versus their cohesion number. If they fail, they end up off-board on the broken track with a chance to return later. Close combat works almost exactly the same, but first the defender gets to fire on you before you engage. You then attack with whatever strength point you have left. Critically, the column shifts are different for close combat than for firing. You get shifts for having substantially more strength points than the target and for having higher cohesion. But you lose shifts when attacking upslope or if you have lower cohesion. Finally, with close combat, there's always a second roll on the cohesion test table, even if you get no result on your attack. If you did get no effect, you roll on a special cohesion table that has there's a white column where you're as likely to lose a step or retreat as the defender is. I like this combat system and the dice as digit system. It gives the designers a non-bell curve table, but with many more results than a 1 to 6 or a 1 to 10 table. And it's really interesting that the same CRT is used for both fire combat and close combat, just the dice roll modifiers are different. When units are hit, they may lose a step or may just take a morale hit, which degrades their capabilities slightly. After the fire and movement steps of an activation, there's a rally step where, if you chose a defend or rebuild activation, you'll be able to remove some of those morale hits or try to rebuild lost steps. Once you've gone through these steps for all the units in the active brigade, that brigade marker is flipped to its used side and another chit is drawn, and so on until all the chits have been pulled from the cup. At the end of the turn, there may be a few victory point determinations, depending on the turn, and then all the brigade counters are flipped back up and the units on the broken track are moved one space forward until they're in the available box where they may be rebuilt. Move the turn record marker, check for reinforcements, and refill the chit cup for the next turn. And so it goes, back and forth until time runs out. Victory is awarded both for losses inflicted, every unit in the eliminated box or anywhere on the broken track at the end of the game counts against you, as well as certain VP hexes. The VP hexes have various values, usually just 1 or 2 points, but they aren't all symmetrical. That is, some give 1 point for one side but none for the other. And there's also a few that give one side or the other points for control partway through the game. For example, there's points for holding Fox's Gap at 10:30 a.m. This incentivizes the rebels to hold it at least till then. They would be very likely to lose it over the course of the game, but this victory condition means they shouldn't abandon it immediately. And of course, Turner's Gap is worth 5 VP to whoever controls it at the end. It's possible the Confederates could lose Turner's Gap and still win, but probably unlikely. It's more possible they could hold it but still lose because the North scored more casually VP and or picked up a bunch of other small VP locations. So it's kind of a matter of trying to be everywhere at once for both sides. Oh, I almost forgot. There's a killer event chit that enters the game about a third of the way through and then leaves at about the 2/3 mark. It's called Indecision. Like many battles, this was a confused thing, especially given the mountainous terrain and the lack of line of sight for the commanders. When the Indecision chit is drawn in a turn, it reduces all activation numbers for commanders by 2 for the rest of the turn. So after it's drawn each turn, there will be many more limited activations and fewer full activations. But you never know when in the turn it'll come. So on turns when it's still in the cup, you want to get your most important activations done as soon as possible to avoid the indecision. For a similar stretch of turns, the artillery must rest. Each player can only use 2 artillery steps per turn for the middle of the game. This really diminishes the effects of artillery in the game to the final third, as you'll be using the first third just to get your guns to position. Another new twist to me in this series is that each of the 3 scenarios has its own fog of war chart. It's a small thing, but the 2 smaller scenarios have fog of war events that aren't on the full scenario, allowing the designer to put a little more flavor specific to that part of the action. But the full scenario is the main event, of course. The rebels have just enough to try hold Fox's Gap. Both sides will likely be shredded in the south regardless of who wins. Just as you feel you're running out of units, the reinforcements start coming in, but slowly, as the indecision chit may slow everything down. Depending on how you assign limited activations when they come up, you're likely going to end up with some formations that only barely make it to contact before the end of the game. The Union player has to decide how much to throw at Turner's Gap and how much to use trying to capture the outlying victory point spots. The Confederate has to counter those choices, but also has to finesse how much ground to give up versus how many losses to take. The rebel forces are more brittle than Yankees, but the rebels are almost always uphill from the attackers. I really like this game, and I continue to play it. The series has come a long way since Stonewall's Sword. I really like the reduced number of event chits in the cup each turn. You still get the full range of events, but you never know what's coming each turn. As well, the event chits for each side may vary a bit more from previous titles I've tried. Each game I've played in the series handles cavalry a bit differently as well. There's not much of it here, but I appreciate it being able to be dismounted and used as infantry. What's really great about this game is its reinforcement schedule. Both sides start out with very little. The Confederates start with nothing that can defend the north part of the map, but the Union only has a couple of cavalry units to try and grab victory locations there. Slowly more brigades and divisions begin to trickle in on both sides, filling up the chit cup turn by turn. In the north half of the map, the 2 sides can reach the prime locations at about the same time. In the south, it's more a case of how the fight for Fox's Gap plays out and when the Union can break out, spending part of their force to add in at Turner's Gap, and part to try to pick off a couple smaller VP spots. The rule about certain Union divisions only being able to play on the north side of the main road and some on the south side was a design decision to keep the Union from being able to mass all their troops in one place. Reading the rules, it rubbed me the wrong way at first, but in practice it works great. It forces the initial fight at Fox's Gap and then later makes it a sprint for small fights for some of those victory point locations. Crucially, all units can stray 2 hexes either side of the road, and Turner's Gap's victory point hex is right on that road, so you don't really worry about it too much for the main fight for Turner's Gap. Steve Carey's done a really good job here. The research and decisions on unit strength are deep. You'll notice that the strengths vary widely. Apparently there was a real problem with stragglers after 2nd Manassas, which happened just before South Mountain. Especially on the Confederate side, many units were under strength due to stragglers and missing men that would eventually return before Antietam, which was looming. I'd be interested in a version of this game where the reinforcement schedule was a little more random, maybe a bit like Guns of Gettysburg, if anyone knows that game. But that's a small quibble, and why tinker with something that feels so balanced? In my 3 plays of the full scenario, the winning victory point count was always within 5 points of the loser. That might just be the way I played, but it feels fairly tight to me. I can certainly envision a play where one side or the other might throw in the towel early, but it never happened to me. So I definitely recommend this game. The components are what you expect from Revolution. Good 5/8 inch encounters by Charlie Kibler and a paper map in a new Rick Barberesque style by Edmund Hudson. And there's been an upgrade in the rule books. While the series rules are still in black and white, the exclusive rules are on full color glossy paper. There's even an illustrated example of fire combat. One other little quibble would be maybe more examples of play would be welcome. But it's great, and a great package design by Mark Mahaffey. So check out A Greater Victory. The boxed edition is $85, but if you want to save a few bucks, the Ziploc version is only $70. Oh, and I should also mention there's a very good vassal module. It takes a little bit to figure out the intricacies of filling the cup each turn, but once you get that down, it's very smooth to use. Up next, Border States from Shakos Games. In some ways, the exact opposite of the previous game. Also set in the American Civil War, this is more of a strategic view, though only of the 5 border states. It's also more abstract, much shorter, and on the realism versus game scale, leans way over to the game side. In fact, if I were into definitions, I'd call this more of a Wuro than a war game, but it's a very fun game, whatever you call it. The game comes in a small box, 9.5 by 5.5 by 1.5 inches. It includes a nice plastic insert for storing the components once you've got them sorted. These components include blocks with leader stickers, about an inch square, like a Columbia block, a bunch of small colored influence cubes in a bag to draw them from, and some larger wooden state pieces whose color and shape corresponds to each of the 5 border states on the map board. Said board is a mounted trifold board of about 15 by 9 inches. It's not a map of the border states themselves, but rather a more traditional abstract game board. On one end is a small turn track, on the other is a spot for holding the 3 battle cards. In the middle are spots for each of the 5 border states, with a track leading away from each towards each player. So there's a track with a state name in the middle, and then a spot on either side towards each player where they would try to move the state markers to permanently reside, and then a waypoint in between on each player's side, and so on for each of the other 4 states. And finally, there's cards, sort of poker width, but extra long. The majority of the cards are Civil War battles and have a size rating of 0 to 2 on them, and the rest are a small deck of personality cards for each side with special capabilities on each one. The premise of the game is that control of the border states will lead to victory in the Civil War. There's a couple ways to win. The first is the automatic type. This can be done by either player amassing permanent influence in 4 different states or 5 total permanent influence markers in any states. But if an auto victory isn't achieved by game end, then the winner, who is whoever has the most influence tokens on their side of the board at game end, both counting the midpoint marks and in the secure permanent spots. To set up the game, you throw all the little colored influence cubes in the draw bag, you set out the map and the turn track, and then set the state tokens for each state on the board. Each state has 4 tokens. Most of them go in the middle between the 2 players, but 2 Missouri tokens go on the waypoint on the Union side, and 2 of the Delaware tokens go on the waypoint on the Confederate side. As the game progresses and these markers get moved, it's important to note that once one is moved from the waypoint to a player's permanent side of the board, it never comes back. But it can be moved from a waypoint back to the center of the board and maybe even over to the other side's waypoint. There are 17 battle cards, but only 15 are used each game, so you shuffle the deck, discard 2, and use the rest as the deck. Each player similarly gets to randomly choose 4 of their 5 character cards, so there's a little randomness to the setup each game, enhancing replayability. Each player also has 10 wood blocks with a general on each. They're flipped over, and each player draws 4 and stands them up in front of them so that they can see the generals, but their opponent can't. Then they stand up their other 6 generals in a horizontal row behind the front 4. This line of 6 is the recruitment pool. A player can only choose a general from either end of this recruitment pool line, so random initial order is important here as well. Each player also has a president card, one with Lincoln and one with Davis. These cards can be spent once per game to choose a general not from the end of the recruitment line, but anywhere in the middle. So best to save it for a 10th spot. The game is played in 5 rounds, one for each year of the war. However, that's a pretty loose framing, as we'll immediately see. To start each round, 3 cards are taken from the battle deck and placed along one side of the game board. The battles are completely random and have no relation to the actual time they took place. So even though the first round of the game is 1861, the battles might be Gettysburg or Appomattox. So right away we see the game isn't strictly historical, but no matter. Each of the battles has a number between 0 and 2. This tells us how many influence cubes are up for grabs for that battle. When you look at the number, you then draw that many cubes from the bag and plus 2 more. So a 0 battle gets 2 cubes, a 1 battle gets 3 cubes, and a 2 battle gets 4 cubes. You set the cubes at the bottom of the battle cards. You'll notice that the cubes are colored and match the colors of the 5 states. So we can see that each game, every battle is going to randomly influence different states because they come out of the bag completely randomly. These little cubes are what you're battling for, with the winner of any given battle getting to place the influence cubes in states that correspond to the colors of the states. It's very intuitive game-wise, if a bit oblique history-wise. When the battle cards are placed at the end of the game board, each one also makes its own little battle board with a space for 4 to 8 blocks, depending on the battle side. The blocks will be arranged in 2 rows, but players will eventually place their generals in either or both rows. If we look at a card for a large battle, for example, it has 8 squares, 2 rows of 4 spots each. Each row is said to be a front. I'm not sure what a front means in terms of history in this context, but it soon makes good game sense. So, we've got the round set up with 3 battles and a bunch of influence cubes up for grabs for each battle. Then we move on to combat. There are 3 rounds of combat, and in each round, each player will play 2 of their generals from their hand to fronts in battles of their choice. Now's a good time maybe to look at the generals. Each general has a strength number between 1 and 3, and each also has a set of Roman numerals between 1 and 3, and they might have 1, 2, or 3 of the Roman numerals. The Roman numerals indicate which of the 3 battles that general can be placed on. There's also a 0-rated general for each side that has a special ambush capability, and each side also has a -2 general. The -2 is one you'll end up having to play and try not to hurt yourself with. Back to combat. Each player starts by choosing 1 general from either end of their recruitment line and adds it to their hand. Then from their hand, they each choose 2 generals to play. They stack the blocks in front of them, and the order is important, as the top blocks will be flipped over simultaneously. The face-up generals' ratings are compared, and the player with the lower-rated general will place their generals on the battle cards first. If tied, there's a simple mechanism for alternating each time there's a tie. The player who is to place their blocks first looks at their face-up general and checks the Roman numerals. This tells you which battles both of those blocks can be placed in. You then place both your blocks in any of the battles that correspond to the Roman numerals, one face up and one face down. Then the other player places theirs in a similar fashion. Both players then choose another general from their recruitment line, choose 2 more blocks from their hand and repeat the process, and then again once more. Of note here is that in the first round, each player will have a hand of 5 blocks to choose from, then a hand of 4 to choose from, and finally a hand of 3 to choose from. So some planning ahead here helps as well. Once all 3 rounds are done, each player will have played 6 blocks somewhere across the 2 fronts of the 3 battles. Before resolving the battles, another note. Remember that small hand of 4 character cards each player got at the beginning of the game? Those cards can be played at any time along with the general blocks. The caveat being, once a card is played, it's discarded from the game. So each player has 4 cards giving them 4 special moves. Each card is unique, but they do things like let you peek at an opponent's face-down block or provide you with protection against the ambush general, things like that. Anyway, the battles are then finally resolved, one at a time. The face-down generals are flipped up. If the battle contains one of the ambush blocks, it gets to eliminate one of an adjacent blocks, hopefully one of your opponent's blocks. Hopefully you haven't been maneuvered into a position where you only have your blocks next to your ambush block. And then you have to look at the two fronts on the battle and you total up all the generals' ratings on each front. Whichever front has the most generals points is the winning front. The losing front won't matter. Then you check which side on the winning front has the most general points, and that's the battle winner. The winner gets most or all of the influence cubes for that battle and places them on their side of the board with matching up the colors with the different states. The second and third battles are resolved in the same way. By the end, both players will have an array of influence cubes pertaining to each state. So now the state tokens gets moved. State by state, you check which player has the most influence. If tied, no state influence marker is moved for that state. But if one side has more influence than the other, then the more influential side gets to use the difference in influence cubes for that state to move the state markers. For example, if the Union had 2 influence cubes for Missouri, but the Confederates had 4, the Confederates would get to make 2 marker moves with Missouri. They could move 1 marker twice or 2 markers 1 move each. Remember that most markers start in the middle and can be moved towards either player. So in this case, the Confederate player could move one of the Missouri markers from the middle to the Confederate waypoint and then move it again to the Confederate protected space, ensuring that the Union could never move that marker back. The same method is used to resolve influence in all 5 states. After that, all those influence cubes are set aside. They don't go back in the bag. I checked this one online as I couldn't find that rule in the rule book. And then that's the 1 year done. Each player will have 1 general left in their hand and 3 in the recruit line. Those 3 are moved into the hand, and the 6 that were in the battles are placed face down and randomly put back in the recruitment line. The 3 battle cards are discarded and 3 new battles drawn, and you're ready to go in. On to the next year if no one has won an automatic victory. You play the full 5 years and determine the winner. The gameplay is in under an hour for sure, even on first learning it. The components are great. The rules are straightforward. The gameplay is really fun. At its heart, it's a kind of a bluffing and trying to trick your opponent into playing their generals in the wrong place game. You want them to overload certain spots that you have no interest in, or to place their top generals in a spot where you can ambush them. Well, the 2 front idea for each battle doesn't make much sense to me in terms of theme or history. As a gameplay device, it's really clever as both players can play on both fronts of each battle. It also means good generals also end up on the losing front and have no impact. And of course, which influence cubes end up on which battle drives a lot of the action. If you made a move on Kentucky last year, I might need to concentrate on a battle that gives me the most Kentucky influence cubes this year in an effort to try and pull the Kentucky status marker back my way. There's lots going on between the distribution of the influence cubes, the differing size of the battles, the character cards, and the random distribution of the generals. There's lots of choices to be made, plenty of replayability. We certainly felt that no 2 games were the same. As I said earlier, I don't feel like all the game mechanics feel like I'm doing something related to the Civil War, but there's plenty of things that do work thematically, the generals' ratings being the most obvious, but also the character cards and their special abilities. And the overall theme of trying to influence the border states works. It's all a bit more abstract than your typical Civil War game, but it's a fun light game all the same. Plenty of decisions and interaction. I hardly recommend it as a filler in the best sense. It's quick, but not stupid. I want to say thanks to Shakos for sending me this and Saladin to review. I don't usually spend much time with short games. It was worth seeing how much game can be packed into 45 minutes. I had my eyes open a little bit with these. Okay, time for a bit of a hats off bouquet. I've got to say, in more related GMT news, their game Nevsky, the first of the Levian campaign series by Volko Runke, has now been made available to play on the Rally the Troops website. It enforces the rules, and you can play live or asynchronously. I'm trying it out, getting my butt kicked handily by fellow cardboard pusher Brendan, but I'm really enjoying it. Volko's Wilderness War is also there, which I'm eager to try, and I'm on my second game of PAX Pamir there. I find it really kicks the learning into high gear when the game shows you what you can and can't do, and you have the pressure of an opponent or opponents bearing down on you. I've also played Rommel in the Desert and Shores of Tripoli there, and both went very smoothly. And they have a few of the games from the Hammer of the Scots series there as well. Richard the Third, Julius Caesar, and Crusader Rex. This is so good to see. The occasional war game makes it onto Board Game Arena or Yukata, but Rally the Troops, at least so far, is all historical games, war games. No need to wade through the Euros to find the gold. The site is run by someone I only know as Tor, so hats off to him for the best new site in wargaming. You can find it at rally-the-troops.com. I heartily encourage you to check it out. Okay, well, this has been a fairly long episode already, so here for parting shots, I'll be brief. In the latest issue of C3 Magazine, there's a guest editorial exhorting us to quit talking about war games like they're simulations or models, or like they're somehow scientific, with the usual cry that we are somehow gatekeeping and we need to bring new players in. And the scientification of our games are scaring new players off. The article caused a little dust up online as expected, and as expected, I find myself on the side of the old farts yet again, if not for the same reasons as the rest of the old farts. First, I'll make the same point I've made many times before. There's tons of entry-level games just waiting to help bring new players into the hobby. If a game like Pacific War looks daunting and complex to a newbie, well, it should. Not all games are for all players. It's not a bad thing to work your way up the complexity scale and find the spot you're comfortable at. If you don't like really complex games, fine, don't play them. But there's plenty of games for all types of players. Not all games have to be accessible or approachable by new players. Second, I can't think I'm the only player who was attracted by Gamebox's promising complexity when I was getting into the hobby years ago. The promise of complexity and depth was a big part of what drew me into wargaming. I assume there's still potential players out there today that might be interested and drawn in the same way. And finally, it's worth remembering that there are more war games being produced now than ever before. War games of every level of complexity and depth and length. The fact that the type of war games that I like are being produced takes nothing away from the amount of games that you like also being produced. For some reason, the folks that are always banging on about the need to attract new players, they always make it sound like there's no games being produced that do that. Like every time a complex game is made, that's somehow an entry-level game that's not getting made. But it just doesn't work like that. Not all games are for all players, but there's plenty of games for every player. Man, I'm tired of having this conversation. It seems like every 6 months. Anyway, that's a small thing. I have to say goodbye. That's it for another episode of Pushing Cardboard. Please do stop by the website at pushingcardboard.com. Register, have your say in our polls and in our forums, or drop by our Discord server. You can find a link to it on our website or probably just through Discord search or in the show notes. Thanks again for listening. Thanks for all the reviews and the ratings on iTunes. I really appreciate it. And I'll talk to you next time. Thanks again.